Well, the primary thing we were raising was that we seem to be seeing too much indebtedness of the working class in the country, that the banks are just offering easy credit, which are characterized as unsecured credit. That means they are not sure whether the people they are offering credit will be able to pay these debts. This is a serious question because if you have the working class or the majority of the people that are indebted to the banks, when they are unable to pay, then we will then have problems with the banks managing their own economies or their own funds, and they best, or what you call the situation where their lending system is unsustainable, and as a result, the banks won't be able to meet their obligations. You must remember that the primary function of the banks is that they collect monies, which are deposited from clients, and they use that money to borrow to other people in order to make profit. So if they give that money to people who can't pay them, then the original depositors, when they want their money, they will not be able to be paid. This is essentially what happened that led to the international collapse of the financial system.
But as the SACP, are you in a position to tell us why this is happening? Is it simply because banks are reckless, or is it simply because, one, there's demand for it, and also that perhaps it's not as risky as the SACP thinks it is?
There's also a relationship between this recklessness and also the demand. Because of the dire situation of the poor people, the working class in the main, they demand credit. Because of that, the institutions which are also facing serious difficulties, in order to make a quick buck, you must also remember that a majority of this credit that they are offering to the poor are having high interest rates. That's where they think it's an opportunity to make quick buck, and therefore they're offering the people these loans in order to get to make the quick buck. So on their part, the banks, we must say, are completely reckless.
But are the banks not caught between a rock and a hard place here? Because I remember not so long ago when people were saying, well, credit extension is becoming a problem. People can't access credit in this country. In fact, there were campaigns wherein banks were asked to give people credit. And they give people credit, they are said to be reckless.
No, we campaigned for the banks to give people credit, not recklessly. In the past, for instance, you will not be given credit. Say, for instance, you are staying in Soweto. It didn't matter whether you are a professional or you can be able to afford to pay. Black people Soweto will be redlined, so they use the word. They will redline black areas and so forth. So they will not offer even professionals staying in those areas, whether they want to venture into their own businesses and so forth. They will not get credit. So we felt that it was a discriminatory approach and unfair. And on that basis, we fought for the extension of credit to all people who qualifies. We did not say people must be given credit even when they will be unable to pay for it. That is why some of our people now will live without their IDs. That if you have seen, for instance, uncollected IDs at the Home Affairs, because what happens that in the run-up to the elections, there are programs where people are encouraged to vote, and there's easy applications of IDs and so forth. But the same people will come back again because they would have given their IDs to Mashonisas or the loan sharks as well as the banks. Well, the banks don't confiscate the IDs necessarily, but the other institutions that participate equally with the banks even collect the IDs of people. And as a result, those people are unable to function in other spheres of life.
All right. Let me bring in the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank here, Mr. Lesia. I'm not sure how much of what Mr. Mapaila has said you would have heard, but he's worried. He's saying that the banks are reckless. What is the situation where the Reserve Bank is concerned?
The first issue has to do with the stability of the banks, and the other has to do with the conduct of credit providers generally. Right? Then that would include the banks.
Yeah.
These are the stuff that we call market conduct issues. And I think that in dealing with these things, we need to be alive to one thing. When the global crisis set in, we had people from developed countries coming to South Africa trying to understand, what is this National Credit Act that you guys are having? What is this National Credit Regulator that you are having that regulates market conduct? It was at the time at the cutting edge of financial regulation with respect to credit. And what we have actually seen is one of the first in financial regulation. South Africa runs a national credit register such that if anyone who is applying for credit with a credit provider, the credit provider can access that credit register and they would be able to know whether this person has got other facilities or other debts that are currently running. And the Act is very clear. If the credit provider continues to extend credit to a borrower that cannot afford the credit and is thus deemed to be behaving recklessly, there are sanctions that the National Credit Regulator can invoke. That is one set of issues. The second set of issues, which has to do with the issues of financial stability, which I had raised before, has to do with the concern that this unsecured lending could pose a systemic risk to the banks. We have looked at these things. It does not pose a systemic risk to the banks. Why so? What are the facts showing us? What we do know is that unsecured lending of the type that people are talking about is amounting to 50 billion rands. The total assets of the banking sector in South Africa is just under 3.5 trillion rand. That is so the 50 billion rand is less than 1% of the total assets of the banking sector. By no stretch of imagination could this be deemed to be posing a risk to the financial system. Even if that entire 50 billion rand is defaulted and the banks fail to trace any one of the borrowers, the banks are still solid. It would not. Okay. It would not happen.
But Mr.
Fortunately, risk management of the banking system in South Africa is so robust and is at the cutting edge of banking practices in the world. It would be reckless of us to say that this growth is actually posing a systemic risk to the banking industry. It doesn't.
All right, let's bring in the National Credit Regulator then, in the form of Darryl Bennin. Again, thank you very much, Darryl. Do you think that we may be facing a systemic problem here? I was looking at some of the figures that came through from the NCA. You say that in September last year, unsecured lending grew from 21.2 billion rand to 26.45 billion in December. So within a space of about 3 months.
Yes, it did grow, but to your question of do I think that there's a systemic risk, I think I agree with the previous speaker in terms of the views that he's expressed. The overall portfolio of unsecured credit is really small in relation to the entire pie, and the growth is coming off a very large base. Off a very low base. So I think at this stage, the NCR has an investigation underway to review both the drivers of the supply side, in other words, why are credit providers actually extending this form of credit, and also reviewing why are consumers taking it on, so that we can have an informed view, and from that we can make the appropriate action. Absolutely. In fact, the National Credit Act requires that an affordability assessment be done before legal extended credit can take place. And the difficulty that a credit provider often is faced with is the same one that a consumer is faced with. At the time at which the consumer applies for credit, that assessment is done. But life moves on from that point, and there could be life events. The person who is taken on the credit could afford it at the time. Down the line, they lose their job or they become ill, they have some impairment to their income stream. And quite often that is what is causing the problem. So it's not necessarily that one should take the view that at the time of extension anybody's necessarily been reckless. It is what happens down the line.
Mr. Mapaila, after all then that's been said and done, it appears the SACP may very well have sensationalized this matter where there absolutely is no risk of a systemic risk attached to the process at the moment.
No, that's not correct, Kolani. I think what is critical is that both the Reserve Bank and the National Credit Regulator, they are agreeing that there are issues that they're attending to because of their own concerns. The issue should be whether when we raise this concern from outside, are we sensational or not? We are not sensational. We're actually raising the issues that are affecting the people. You must remember we launched a campaign on the transformation and diversification of the financial sector in 2000. We've been running this campaign ever since. So we interface with communities. People still come to us to indicate what needs to be done. In fact, we championed even the introduction of this National Credit Act as the Communist Party. even though, of course, we are not the implementers, so we don't necessarily get the credit. But we fought for this.
Yeah,
that's
but
the reason why.
The point, Mr. Apil, is that, and this is the response that was given by Casco Vadia to us, is that once you start talking about a crisis situation, you're sensationalizing because, one, you don't have information, and as you heard from the Reserve Bank and the NCR, they are investigating with the view to getting that information that will determine whether or not there's a crisis in this area.
No, they're still going to do research, but we're already feeling the pinch. In fact, that doesn't need a rocket scientist. In fact, what I hear the Reserve Bank saying is basically a concerted effort to protect the banks, of course, which is their duty. And I think that I must also emphasize that we do not necessarily share the approach of the S&P. Because the S&P and such instruments or such institutions, they seek to divert or to focus the market. And insofar as their attitudes towards South Africa, the ratings of South Africa and so forth, we understand that. We understand that the Reserve Bank should be concerned about that, particularly when such institutions are beginning to say that.
So are you suggesting the Reserve Bank is protecting banks at the expense of the consumer?
Of course, that's what they're trying to do. There's no doubt about that. I think that that's why I want to emphasize the point that we are protecting the majority of these people who of these increases in various loans who are unable to afford them. This majority of these people will not be able to take even their children to school because they will now be indebted so highly to these institutions. If you open a television or listen to or read adverts, for instance, you will see how money is being circulated by various institutions. So there's a huge increase in the sale of money, that is the sale of credit. There's no doubt about it. In fact, some of the adverts, they even call for people who are in the credit bureau. They say, even if you are in the credit bureau, come to us, we'll give you credit. So these are the issues that we have raised, and there's been phenomenal increase in this regard. So we are beginning to caution against those.
Mr. Khanyago, your response then, the Reserve Bank protecting banks at the expense of the consumers?
I think Mr. Mapaila is disingenuous here. If he is worried that if the SACP's view was that this unsecured lending will lead to a collapse in the banks, and as such people will not have access to their deposits, it goes without saying. It goes without saying that having a sound banking system is in the interest of the consumers, with the Reserve Bank being responsible for systemic stability and the soundness of the banks, and the National Credit Regulator being responsible for the market conduct, the conduct of the different credit providers. As Mr. Mapaila was saying earlier on, practices like confiscation of IDs, confiscation of ATM cards, and those kinds of things, those are the issues that are within the purview of the National Credit Regulator. And I actually think the National Credit Regulator had been doing a bloody good job at that. And to then come around and say that the Reserve Bank is protecting the banks over consumers is incorrect.
And let's take your calls then, starting with Anonymous here in Johannesburg. Good morning.
Good morning, sir, and to your guests. Let me make a quick contribution. I want to pick up from the comments of the NCR. They said some of the SPs are declining applications on appropriate solutions and offering freely the unsecured lending. And I want to challenge the big four banks and Mr. Kaskovidia. My business case was as follows. I was changing banks and I applied for their new bank to take over my overdraft at 7,900. They declined, but they gave me a credit card with 9,500.
Let me start with Mr. Khanyago. Specifically in relation to Anonymous One, who was talking about banks pushing you to unsecured lending, really because they make a lot of interest in terms of payments.
Look, it's a market conduct issue. I think that the National Credit Regulator would be in a better position to comment on that. I just wanted to underscore here, Kolani, to say that we evaluate the credit risk assessment approaches of the banks. When you are a bank and you are regulated in South Africa, the Registrar of Banks goes through would look at your process, your approach towards credit risk and so forth. We are not positioned to deal with individual cases.
All right. Let's hear from the National Credit Regulator then, Daro.
Thank you, Kulani. Just to start off with, I'd like to just share with you some information. Almost 54% of the consumers that are reported at credit bureaus are in good standing, and 75% of the accounts that are reported are in good standing, which means people are largely meeting their obligations. And as we know, the economic times have been tough.
Yeah.
So that actually bodes quite well. When it comes to individual instances where callers have indicated the problems they've experienced, I obviously can't comment because I don't have the facts to their particular cases. But we are available to assist consumers, and that's one of our primary drivers under the National Credit Act is consumer protection. So if we do have consumers and callers who are feeling aggrieved and or perplexed by what it is that they are confronted with, they are more than welcome to call our offices.